Very good evening and welcome to the breakout session on 22nd of April, that's today, with the topic funding and partnership model to drive Indian electronics manufacturing. We have with us Mr. Rajat Verma, the MD and Head Commercial Banking HSBC India. Welcome Rajat for this very important session of MAIT. Focused on the electronics segment.
Thank you,
warm welcome to you. Thanks a lot for sparing your time. First of all, congratulations, Rajat, for the HSBC being awarded the Best Foreign Bank for a second year in the row by the Financial Express. Hearty congratulations from me and as well as industry.
Thank you once again.
So one of the very important points that I'm sure every banker would be looking at and every industry person will be keen to know is in the last 14 months, to be precise, the pandemic has created havoc in the industry. How do you think the banking industry has been able to cope up? What are the challenges that the banking industry look at? And how do you see the bank has been able to support the industry? And what has been HSBC's focus and role in this?
Yeah. No, the pandemic is, we all hope it's once in a lifetime, and it's been a terrible, terrible tragedy for so many people. Banking industry has been, I think, at the forefront of dealing with the issues that were raised by the pandemic. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging and saluting all, not just HSBC, but banks across the country and across the world, where it was deemed as an essential service, and people have kept the wheels of finance and the wheels of industry running to the best of their ability, and staff have been coming to office right all through last year and even now. So a lot of credit to the banking industry. They're as much COVID warriors as other industries as well, and that's been recognized by the ministry as well. So in our own when we started off early end March is when India's last year when the pandemic started. We had some experience being an international bank. We had some visibility of what was happening in other parts of the world before it hit India. So we knew how bad it could be. But I can tell you that we completely underestimated the extent of the problem. Nobody could have thought that sitting 1 year later into more than a year later, you're still talking about nothing but the pandemic. So it's had a terrible impact. But having said that, there are a lot of things that have emerged which are positive. Our own resolve as a country to produce more, to innovate and to grow more and further is one of those positives, I would say. The activity levels of corporates, many corporates have become more vigilant and more cost efficient, I think, during these times, and have thought through their business models more carefully. And I think the other thing that interest rates have come down. Nobody would have said that, it's sitting earlier before that interest rates would have come down almost 200-300 basis points in a period of 12 months. And there's several other things I think we can take as positives from a very difficult time. So yeah, perhaps it's an over-optimistic assessment of the pandemic. But we've got to look for the positives.
India's economic growth is projected to improve. Which are the key sectors that you think would attract investments from global investors? And where do you see the GDP growth of India heading to in the near term and longer term?
I'll tackle the GDP growth point first. I think India, most economists are saying anything between 11 to 12% growth for this fiscal. Or for, I think that's a reasonable estimate. Of course, you must realize and recognize across the world, you are seeing some exceptional growth rates coming through the US, China, etc. You've seen some very high numbers coming through. And in India, we'll see maybe we will also see very good numbers. Some of it, a large part of it, you have to discount as the base effect. You lost some of the base and you're gaining some of it back. So really, how much has the needle moved from not T-1, but T-2 is what you have to see. But having said that, I think the recovery in India is real. It is across many, many sectors. more technology, more efficiency, etc. So I think we're going to come out of this, are going to do well. I think I also believe that whilst consumption sectors, some of the consumption sectors have taken a beating during pandemic. So I was just saying that the sectors are pharma, healthcare, I would think infrastructure as well, telecom equipment, mobile phones, or the topic perhaps of that is most interesting to people on this call. But there are many sectors. Okay, there's renewable energy as a sector, which is of great promise, and you can see that where there is an opportunity for growth, the government is kind of putting a flag out there, 10x or in 5 years' time. So I think the sectors are almost. You look at PLI and you can call out many of the sectors that I would say, which are likely to do well in the next 5 years.
Rajat, as you may be aware, the government of India, considering the target that they have set in the national policy of electronics for to be about $400 billion by 2025, the government of India has come up with several schemes to support this industry in the form of production-linked incentive. RODTEP has been announced. We have a capital subsidy that's got announced through a scheme called SPECS, which is actually a MTRIPS replacement. There are some fiscal measures that have got announced, like reduction in taxes and so on. With significant growth projected in the electronics segment in India, there is obviously going to be a need of capital, more so, and support from the banking sector in the form of debts for setting up new projects and also for working capital funding. One of the challenges that the industry has been facing over the last couple of years is support from banking sector in terms of setting up new projects, primarily because of the fact that the Indian banking segment still doesn't believe the electronics growth story, because that is relatively new to this country, right? Compared to an infrastructure industry or whatever. So how do you see the banking segment, gearing up to be able to support this particular industry, which is probably going to be growing at a very, very rapid pace? Projected CAGRs are in the range of 16 to 21% plus. And also, in terms of drain on foreign exchange, is probably the number 2 after oil. So government is focused on, having Make in India, Atmanirbhar in the electronics industry. So where do you see the banking segment supporting this industry to be able to grow, whether it is domestic lending or is it going to be global funding coming in? Or we wish to hear your views on that.
No, I think it's an excellent question. And the answer would be that there are many, there is no one answer to this, to my mind, Mr. Nagaraj. So let me try to explain what I'm saying. This sector will have some very large players coming into the country and setting up shop there and opening up an ecosystem. That obviously lends itself to lending on supply chain financing, right? Because at one end you have a very massive global top 50, top 100 company setting up shop here to manufacture, or through their manufacturers perhaps, or indirectly or directly. And then you'll have an ecosystem built around that. Let us take the case of mobile phones, for instance, where there are 5 or 6 large players across the world. And their ecosystem, therefore, is reasonably mature for, and financing has been done in other parts of the world. It may be new in India, but using the supply chain, the power of that supply chain, the power of their receivables to very high quality counterparties, financing is, to my mind, is possible. And it's working capital financing, but it's certainly possible. And it's certainly likely to be relatively not very expensive financing, because it's risk mitigated financing. It is not dependent on, extraneous factors like approval, land, government approvals, etc., or project or demand. It is more dependent on payment history of large corporates. The other thing I would say is that setting up of manufacture, you're going to get some very large players who will have access to capital, right? This is a industry where you need large pockets, but you also will have an ecosystem which will need smaller amounts of investments, in the tens of crores or the hundreds of crores rather than the thousands of crores, right? So you will have and even in the ones of crores. So you'll have all types of counterparties. And I think for the smaller counterparties, we do as a country need to come to think through what are the mechanisms to support a relatively new and nascent industry. Now, that could be through the form of, credit support from agencies which are involved in export products, support through, export agencies, etc. Or even they could look at financing for import. If they are importing capital goods, then finance from the Exim banks of those countries is also a very viable mechanism. So there will be a combination of characteristics which will need. So at one end, just to repeat my points, at one end you could have credit support given by central body agencies for a certain percentage. You can't expect everything. It's a possibility to think about. I'm not saying it's the right answer, the wrong answer. The other interest subvention could be thought about as a method, especially for exporters, but even maybe not for exporters. So when you want to encourage an industry, you can give subsidy in A manner or B manner or C manner. One of the ways of supporting a new industry is interest subvention. Certainly, exporters are already benefiting from subvention. Textile industry benefits from that, and other industries too. So there are many methods, many solutions to this. Ultimately, I would like to draw a parallel here to the renewable industry, which has significantly higher percentage of capital requirement than perhaps your industry as a percentage of the capital, of the cost of production. And it was not very easy. So large pockets of equity capital is also required through either private equity or sponsor support or maybe seed funding. That is also quite important because banks will want some amount of skin in the game before they can lend. It's only natural to expect that they will want a certain debt equity ratio to be maintained in project financing. So it's a combination of factors. But I think we have seen that despite all the challenges, sectors like renewables and other sectors have come a long way in the last 4 or 5 years. And they have now they regularly access foreign bond markets, Indian domestic bond markets, Indian banks, etc. So there is no reason why this sector will not be able to do that. It has got all the fundamental characteristics of good buyers, good demand, and therefore, and relatively low extraneous risk factors. Like, for example, in the power industry, you have other risk factors, right? So those don't exist in this industry. So there is, if a combination of these factors come, then it can be quite a successful model for financing.
Thanks, Rajat. One of the important factors for the growth is to make sure that market access to India is enabled. Market access to India sometimes can be complicated, right? What is the role of HSBC in facilitating market access for global investors across various anchor units, OEMs, ODMs, so that you are able to have an ecosystem in the country, which is obviously lacking in India?
No, great question, Ms. Nagaraj. I think the role that a bank can play is beyond financing in the manner that I think you are suggesting, perhaps through the question, which is that banks need to encourage not just financing or the opening of accounts or the movement of money, which obviously banks need to do. That's their primary function. But they also need to be able to explain to foreign investors what the local regulations are. Perhaps they can give advice as to who local partners could be based on their own experience or their advisory capabilities in the country. They could handhold the foreign companies through what, from a foreign company's point of view, is a complicated environment. Because at the end of the day, it is a exchange controlled environment where you have certain regulatory filings. So the regulation bit is always whenever I talk to foreign companies or investors, they always want to understand how will the bank help me understand regulations? How will they help me meet those regulations from a foreign exchange point of view? Or from an investment point of view, from an FDI point of view. And therefore, banks have quite an important role in I would say, to summarize, hand-holding in regulations and supporting in regulatory support, advisory support as and when kind of required. And of course, the third and probably equally important method is to be able to invest in the ecosystem. So it is not sufficient. I would not be able to understand the industry if I speak to 3 out of 100 players. But I would be in a much better position to understand the industry if I speak to 30 out of those 100 players and understand the dynamics and the credit risk and mitigants in that industry. And therefore, through industry forums such as yourselves and other forums, banks have a role to at least help as a participant in getting industry bodies and companies together so that they can thrash out and talk through their problems.
Thanks, Rajat. One of the other important areas for industries to grow to make sure that this whole supply chain financing is addressed, because there is a working capital cycle, right from procurement of raw materials to a conversion to a sale in the market and realizations and paid back. So there are, we have seen other countries, coming up with various products and instruments in terms of being able to address the supply chain so that the whole working capital gap is reduced to the extent possible. So what are the product trends or the innovations that you see are coming up, and what are your thoughts on that to make sure that this whole supply chain financing in for the Indian market to grow is sort of addressed?
Right. Okay, so I'll answer that question in two ways. The first is that how do you reduce the need for financing, firstly? And that is by getting a more efficient transaction management platform. So, for example, today you must have heard of distributed ledger financing or distributed ledger processing, which people call blockchain. Which is essentially, so what if your working capital cycle used to be 15-20 days from issuing an LC, getting it accepted by a bank, getting your funds, showing the goods, etc. Under a blockchain environment, you could complete all of that in 1, 2, 3 days. So your need for working capital goes down as it is. You don't need the 20, 30 days extra or 15 days extra of credit. So, and other than efficiency benefits. So the first and it's not artificial today. There are many transactions that we've done for Indian corporates and globally as well. So I would say that this is at a point, these are exponential curves. Today, you can see only 10, 15 transactions in India, but that doesn't mean next year you'll only see 30. Next year, you might see 10 times or 100 times or 1,000 times of transactions, because it just makes sense. It's less costly, it's simple, it's safe. So you're going to see an explosion of this transaction. Now, I cannot predict whether it will come in 1 or 2 years or 3 years, I don't know. But certainly it's the way to go. So reducing the need is one part of the answer. The second part of the answer is that banks have to rely on move beyond conventional balance sheet metrics, especially in a new industry, to cash flow based lending. So what I mean by that is, and not only banks, you need the participation of insurance companies as well. All over the world, financing is done on the back of insurance. And in India, you are not allowed to, it's one of the things that is being contemplated, and maybe it will be allowed for financing by banks as well, but it's an enabler. So supplying on the back of cash flow and, payment needs, post-shipment financing is easy. Pre-shipment financing is a little more complicated, right? Post-shipment financing, once you have an order and you have a track record, it's relatively easy for banks to finance that. It's pre-shipment when it comes to pre-shipment or financing the supplier's supplier. So if you're supplying to a very large company and somebody else is supplying to you, how does a bank fund the supplier's suppliers? Now, those things are less developed today. And but with the advent of certain systems like TREDS and OCEN and more data availability, I think you'll find, and GST data and other forms of data, you'll find that banks are moving towards more of a cash flow scorecard based lending for small amounts. You will not find a bank doing scorecard lending for 100 crores, but maybe for a crore or 50 lakhs or, small value transactions. It's quite possible that banks would start using data So I think this is not just for your industry, for any industry. And I see supply chain financing moving from post-shipment to pre-shipment more and moving from supplier to supplier on the back of good data. People who don't have data will not be able to benefit from this, unfortunately, because the scoring would be based on how's your GST track record over the past 2-3 years, etc., etc. And that will be an important factor. A lot of banks, including ours, is already doing something here, but it's still at its nascency, I would say, Mr. Nagraj. So, yeah, but the trend. These are the trends, I would say.
Thanks, Rajat. One last question before I hand it over to Sanjay. One hand, the government is very bullish. The industry is very excited um, to see the growth, and there's a lot of work happening in various forums to grow the electronics segment. There are projections by the government, there are projections by various associations, and so on. No industry can grow without the support of the banking system. So, what is banking? What is Indian banking system's view, in particular, about the electronics industry in terms of lending, and what is HSBC's view in terms of lending to the electronics segment? Do they consider this as a priority sector in terms of lending, and are there any exposure norms or exposure limits or anything that has been set up in general? Because there aren't too many success stories in terms of a larger growth in electronics compared to other industries, because from an electronics manufacturing per se, we are relatively a young industry, but as a consumer, we are a very, very large and a very old player in this market. So where do you see the bank's focus and commitments to support the electronics segment and HSBC's view also?
Yeah, sure. No, I think I would say that banks would look at this segment very positively. It has a lot of potential, basis all the possibilities of the Indian market, of course, but also the possibilities of export. Even our 2020 target, 2025 target is kind of split half between exports and local demand. So today it's almost entirely local demand. So I think banks would see an opportunity to support this sector and they would see this as an opportunity which can scale up quite quickly in 5 years, right? So that would be the primary prism through which banks would be thinking about this sector today. I think the challenges of financing and credit evaluation, etc., are surmountable with some of the things that we discussed today. Obviously, banks have to think through a proposal and then lend. But I do feel that banks will be quite willing and open to discuss with companies here and to grow with the sector. I completely agree that banks are really important for this sector because the scale of growth required is quite large. And I can tell you that banks' role will not just be in their balance sheet support, but in the way that they give ideas to companies to become more efficient, to use trade finance more effectively. Because look, your industry is going to be a heavy trade sector. You're going to import a lot, export a lot. I mean, this flows into a lot of what banks would like to do and support, which is cash flow financing. So I think that, to me, would be a very important area. So I would say that it's a very promising sector, Mr. Nagraj, and it will be good to engage with banks at an early stage and explain the overall plan. It's a very ambitious plan, but like we've seen in many other sectors, until you have that ambition, you don't move forward. And so I'm very glad to see that there is ambition, and I'm very glad to see all of you, looking forward to that. And I'm sure the banking industry will also move along with that.
MAIT as an association is very committed and very supportive overall as an industry, and actively working with the government and all segments to make sure that the vision of the government of India under the Make in India Atmanirbhar is successful. And I'm sure, we will be closely interacting with yourself, Rajat, to see how we can cash in on the experience that HSBC as a global bank has in terms of supporting the electronics segment. So one last question, Sanjay, before I hand it over to you and And the question to you, Rajat, is you have any, as does HSBC have any plans in terms of, how to be able to support or boost the growth of electronics in the country, considering that you have a vast experience globally?
No, so look, through our own activities in supporting the community, call it CSR or whichever term you would like to use, we have an investment along with, we want to support the skills program of the government and of the country. And we've invested very heavily in that program. And we really believe in the fact that, this is a country where skill development is a key need for, value creation. And there's certain sectors that we were focusing on. One of the sectors that we will include would be the electronics sector or allied sectors in the coming period of time. It's an ongoing program, and it's something that we support very, very actively and believe in. So this is a sector which provides foreign exchange employment. It's definitely very positive for the country and for its people. So we certainly want to support the skill development in the sector.
Thanks a lot, Rajat. Sanjay?
Yeah, thanks, Nagraj. So it's really nice to hear Rajat and having his thoughts actually. Actually, this is basically primarily, if you really see, this is a decade of electronic manufacturing in India. Because if you really see the kind of exponential growth which digitization, 5G, IoT, adoption of cloud and all that is going to bring actually into this industry. And with the kind of local demand and with the kind of export prospects which we have, even if we forget the export prospects, if you see the local demand also, I think basically there is quite a good amount of business which we can foresee. So definitely it makes sense to invest into the electronic industry. But one thing which I wanted to point out actually, Rajat, is that basically one is that we get Apples and Samsungs actually basically from outside, and finances for them is not a hassle actually. For them basically, I think HSBC will also not have any problem, because for their financing, we hardly need not discuss also actually, really speaking. Actually, the real core manufacturing will only happen when the local companies get into the manufacturing activity. Then only the country will benefit and the jobs will be created and the local manufacturing will happen. Else basically just it will be a shift of manufacturing from here to there. So actually I am foreseeing that is going to happen. So basically we will need more active support from the banks, from people like you who understand the industry, who are supportive, which I could understand from your talks. So that will really help that industry to grow. So that will be a booster. Like I'll give you an example. Like basically if I approach a financial institution, the major issue I find is we cannot find a peer of yours. Whom should we consider your peer? So basically on the electronic industry, their financing exposure is so low actually that they find it very difficult to find peers. They are asking me for a local peer. They're not asking for an international peer. So basically finding local peers is difficult. So I can say all about myself, but finding a peer is not my job at all. So slowly, I think once the industry gets more matured, that the peers and all those things will be created. But I like the way which you suggested. More than the balance sheet, the cash flow becomes more important. So that is basically, I think that is one way wherein basically you can see that you can really see how the cash flow is moving and what kind of basically the business generation is there, and that will give you real-time inputs. I think that was a good feedback from your side. So really, on behalf of MAIT, I would like to thank you, Rajat, and basically Nagraj, MAIT Finance and Chair MAIT Finance and Investment Group, and also like to thank all the audience who were here so as to attend the session. We will look forward for your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Nagaraj, Sanjay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. You have a good evening and stay safe.